Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is UN Women Headquarters. My name is Anna Felt. Welcome you all to this webinar on sexual harassment, the risk of not taking action in the workplace. It is organized as part of our We Empower program, which is funded in partnership with the European Union and the ILO. So before we get started, I would like to, we can go to the next slide, Diana. I would like to have a few poll questions for all of you. I'm going to go over the poll questions and some introductory remarks, and then I'll hand over to Ana Catalina at ILO and Gisela Hansen Rodriguez at Dianova. Then we'll have an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, and then we'll close around 10 o'clock or 10, a few minutes past 10, since we have been waiting for everyone to join. So let me just start with some poll questions that I hope to get a little bit of a sense of who is online and where you're from. So the first question is, what country are you from? Because of our We Empower program focuses specifically on the G7 countries, we have as option A, Canada, B, US, C, any other G7 country like France, Germany, Italy, Japan, or the UK. D, any other EU country, or any other country in the world, you tick E. So we see here that the majority are actually from a G7 country, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, or UK. It's about 30%, and also 26% from other EU countries. So welcome EU to this webinar, and also welcome to those 8% from Canada and 13% from the US. And everyone else out there in the world, you are also highly represented. Thank you so much. We'd also like to know, are you a woman or a man or other? How do you identify yourself? Woman, man, or other? Excellent. We have 82% women and about 18% men. So welcome both women and men to this webinar. I have another question. We'd like to know from if you are working in academia and university, are you from government, business, private sector, media, civil society, or if you are from the UN system, you can also pick civil society. Okay, we have majority civil society followed by the private sector. We have some government officials, academia and university, nobody from media. So I'll close this question. And we'd like to know, before we get started, how informed are you with policies on sexual harassment at work? So are you feel very informed, somehow informed, or not informed at all, but hope that the information today will give you some insights? Okay, so we have a good knowledge. We have the majority of somehow informed, and it's quite equal actually, somehow informed and informed. So we have informed community, but we hope that we can bring you some extra insights today to this conversation, and also to hear from you, since you have a lot of insight into this area. We'd love to hear from you after the presentations. Also what knowledge you have and what policies you think are good practice in your countries and across the world. Okay, so let's get started. From the perspective of the We Empower program, we can go to the next slide, Diana. Okay, maybe you can go back one step. So I can just let everybody know that if you have questions during the conversation, you can go to the chat box called questions and input your questions there. You can also raise your hand if you want to speak. So let's move on quickly. We come from it from a perspective of the Women's Empowerment Principles. There are 7 principles that were launched in 2010 by the Global Compact and UN Women after extensive consultation with various stakeholders. And this community has really built up over the years. And every week we have newcomers into the WEPS, as we call it, Women's Empowerment Principles community. And there's companies from all sizes, sectors, and across the world. And they're all engaged and interested in promoting gender equality and empowering women in the workplace, marketplace, and community. So this is the framework that we are going from. Next slide. Looking at principle 2 to 4 specifically, we have under 2 and 3 specific workplace issues, and also 4. But if we zoom in on the 3rd principle, this is where we cover the health, safety, and freedom from violence. And it's really about zero tolerance for violence, harassment, and sexual exploitation. But it also covers other form of unsafe conditions. So this is one of the areas that we are covering under the principle number 3. And it's important also for in this guidance to companies not to only emphasize the zero tolerance, but also to look at both the prevention and the effort to support the victims or the survivors of violence and those exposed to sexual exploitation and harassment and the whole range of issues that could be faced in the workplace. But also to have a grievance process and resolution and non-retaliation mechanisms in the workplace that both women and men feel that they have a safe space to do so. Let's move on to the next slide. So we have here, we are based in New York. We have the New York State has recently legislated mandatory training on sexual harassment, that every company, no matter the size in our state here, have to conduct sexual harassment training. And what we are looking at in some of their definitions, there's a lot of work happening in the aftermath of the Me Too movement. Many definitions that are being developed, and basically the ones that have been prepared by the New York State specifically for all the companies is that it's an unwelcome, meaning not consensual, sexual conduct in the workplace, and that it consists of verbal and physical sexual advances, sexual exploitation, explicit statements or discriminatory remarks that are offensive or objectionable to the recipient. It might be implied or linked to one's job security, performance, or promotion. And it's quite interesting looking into the figures. We dived into the figures in Europe and saw that 33% of women in Europe have experienced either physical or sexual violence since the age of 15. And 55% of women in the EU has experienced sexual harassment. This is a very serious situation that needs urgent address. It has very high cost to both women in terms of their well-being, but also the loss in earnings, missed opportunities, and missed promotions because of the efforts that they have to take to overcome these abuses. But it also has very high cost to companies because there's productivity loss and absenteeism and other form of cost to the company. So there's a lose-lose here, and we need to find solutions in form of policies that we get to a win-win situation. And the cost to the global economy has been, of violence against women, has been estimated at about $12 trillion annually. This is a very serious situation. Next slide, please. Just to emphasize here, we have, as UN Women, recently prepared a brief, and after the webinar, we will share this with you together with the webinar recording, the link to this recently launched publication. It was launched now during our 16 days of activism. Basically what it emphasizes that harassment and violence affects all women, regardless of their identity, employment status, their age, their ethnic background. It affects anyone, no matter the sector, etc. And gender equality and decent work are fundamental for preconditions for safe, healthy, and dignified workplaces. So we can move on to the next slide. I just want to give you how it looks, and we also have it on empowerwomen.org, but we'll send you the direct link. Towards an end to sexual harassment, the urgency and nature of change in the area of Me Too. Next. What it has is really the 10 essentials of addressing sexual harassment. I will not go into those points today because we have 2 speakers with us, and they will also go into a little bit more details. But I urge all of you to look into these 10 essentials after the webinar. Next. So this gives me the pleasure to introduce the first panelist, Ana Catalina Ramirez. She is a technical specialist on occupational safety and health at ILO. So Catalina, can we hear you? Are you there? Let me see. I don't see Ana Catalina. Okay, so let's wait for Ana Catalina. It seems like she dropped off and had some connection problems. So let me introduce Gisela Hansen Rodriguez. She is a clinical psychologist at Dianova. And Gisela, can we hear you? Gisela? Okay, can you try again?
Yes.
Hello, Gisela. Thank you so much. Thank you. We can hear you very well.
Great.
So maybe you could just take a minute to just introduce yourself before you go on with the slides.
Okay, my name is Gisela Hansen. I'm a clinical psychologist in Dianova. in a clinic, well, in a therapeutic community about drugs addiction and gender violence. Actually, I'm a PhD in drug addiction and gender violence as well, and how those variables are acting together in the phenomena. Actually, right now I'm a researcher in the group of behavioral lifestyle and health in women in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and we are coordinating a work group of gender and drugs on regional level in Catalonia. We try to work in advocacy in order to mainstream the gender approach in all our public programs. Okay, we will talk about a little bit how we can prevent sexual harassment at work and how to identify harassment, which is not easy sometimes, and prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, and how to maintain a healthy and productive work environment. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Well, just for a little introduction, I think that Me Too movement was an incredible use of hashtags and social network that opened a space for women to talk about their painful and shameful experience and not feeling alone. But for a long time, most women define their own experience of sexual harassment and assault as something that is not talked about, something private, something that will be shameful to recognize. So, well, not an absolute solution or a movement with the long-term goals, the Me Too movement opened up Pandora's box, a real Pandora's box, stories of sexual violence that spark an activist, along with other campaigns like Time's Up. We can go to the next slide, please, the third one. So what is sexual harassment at work? We can just shortly define it like any unsolicited sexual advance or conduct on the job that create an unpleasant, intimidating, or hostile working environment. Just to have a small definition of the issues. You can go to the next one, slide. Thank you. Although men can also experience situations of violence and harassment in the workplace, it is actually a tiny number in comparison with women who have suffered. The patriarchal cultural system and the consequent stereotypes, inequality and power relations are the responsible for women being those most exposed to this type of abuse. So we can agree, I think we can strongly say that is a gender-based violence situation. One of the most common forms of violence at work is sexual harassment. And what is worrying is about 75% of women with vocational training or those who occupy senior leadership positions have experienced it at some time in their lives, according to a study carried out in 2014 by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. So, however, very few women still dare to tell or report cases of harassment, most of the time for fear of losing their jobs. So, according to the same agency, among the women who have experienced sexual violence at the age of 15 years old, 32% mentioned that they suffered from a perpetrator. The perpetrator was a coworker, a supervisor, or a client. However, just 4% reported this situation to the employer or superior. So we have a big issue here. It is therefore necessary that companies and unions carry out initiatives to raise awareness among employees and employers about the reality of violence and harassment against women in the workplace. So, in DIANOVA, we are strongly committed to promoting gender equality through education, civic engagement, and advocacy actions to help change the social structures and thus contribute to reducing violence against women. So, in the context of 16 Days campaign to raise awareness about gender-based violence, we have created a very, very practical toolkit in order to recognize sexual harassment at work, prevent it, act in case it is necessary, and encourage their peers to report assaults. So the next slide, please. Thank you. Well, this toolkit is addressed to employees and employers, both of them, both clusters, with some practical steps to prevent or deal with sexual harassment. For example, there's a long list of behavior that should be avoided, as you can see in the slide. And this is mostly addressed to employers and employees, both of them. you can notice that there are more evident behaviors and more slight behavior, but all of them are very needed to be mentioned. The next slide, please, 6-1. And there is another part for employers in order to do various steps to reduce the risk of sexual harassment in the workplace, like, for example, adopt a clear sexual harassment policy, employee handbooks, and that handbooks that should include a policy dedicated to harassment. And that policy should as well define sexual harassment at work, state in non-uncertain terms that sexual harassment will not be tolerated, state that any wrongdoers will be disciplined or even fired for serious misconduct, set out a clear procedure for filing harassment complaints, and ensure that all employees know that procedure, because there is an unknown procedure, so it must be very well informed. Also, it's important to train your employees. Set up at least once a year a training session for your employees. This session should teach employers what sexual harassment is and explain that they have all right to a workplace free of sexual harassment. This is not something that you have to stand in any situation. So train your supervisors and managers as well, depending on the size of your business. So you can also conduct separate training sessions for supervisors and manager, and the session should be based on the same themes as the general training session for employees, and include additional aspects on how to deal with sexual harassment complaint. And this is related with the next slide. Okay, so there's a last part which is very, very clear about how to deal with employee harassment complaint. There's a very practical tips for employees. And we strongly recommend keeping an open mind, investigate every complaint you receive, and don't come to any conclusions until your investigation is complete. Don't diminish the importance of a complaint. Treat a complainant with respect, because people often find it extremely difficult to complain about sexual harassment at work. So they feel vulnerable and they might fear for their careers. So employers have to be understanding and empathetic. Also, it's important to interview the people involved and keep it confidential. And at last, take an appropriate action now. Once you have all the information, try to act very quickly. So in conclusion, when sexual harassment is reconsidered as a gender-based violence and violation of human rights rather than as bad behavior, the possibilities around responsibility and reparation are huge. We must engage in a winning fight against harassment at the workplace by calling into question the overall behavior of a company staff and its collective culture, and beyond that, a society in general, because it is a collective responsibility that we should and we must uphold together. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much, and I'll call upon you again once we go into the Q&A session. But so we'll move on with the presentation of Anna Katarina, who I understand is now connected. So let me just unmute Anna. Oh, Anna Katarina, I can see you're unmuted. So please go ahead. Welcome to the webinar.
Good morning, Anna. Good morning to all the participants, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this interesting webinar. So I will divide my presentation into parts. First, I will update you on the ongoing process towards the adoption of an international standard on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. And then I will address some aspects related with responses to sexual harassment in the workplace that will, I think, complement very well the previous presentation. So let's start with the first part on the International Labor Standard. Well, in 2015, the governing body of the International Labor Office decided to place a standard-setting item on violence against women and men in the world of work on the agenda of the International Labor Conference, with a view of a double discussion to take place in 2018 and 2019. In 2016, as part of this process, the office convened a tripartite meeting of experts on violence against women and men in the world of work. As a very first interesting conclusion, the expert group suggested that the concept of violence should be replaced by violence and harassment to ensure that the range of unacceptable behavior is adequately understood and addressed during the discussion process and in the future instrument. In June of this year, we have the first discussion on the instrument that took place during the International Labor Conference. So based on the conclusions of this first discussion, the office have proposed a text to be discussed in June 2019 with a view of a final adoption of the new standard that would be adopted under the form of a convention supplemented by a recommendation. The proposed text that the office has worked on intends to reflect the richness of the discussions and comments that we have received from our member states and our tripartite constituents. So it's an effort to capture the diversity of forms of violence and harassment in the workplace, the different national legislation and practices, but also the evolving nature of the world of work. So next slide, please. I would like to, in this presentation, highlight 3 key elements that are proposed in this text that are pertinent for our today's discussion. Basically, I would like to refer to the what, the who, and the where. I mean, what is violence and harassment in the world of work, who is affected and who is a perpetrator, and where it can happen. So let's start by the what. So the proposed definition reflects that in this text reflects the agreement of maintaining the concept of violence and harassment as a single concept to give more flexibility to members when defining national responses, as it was recommended by the experts meeting. The definition of violence and harassment refers to, as you can see in the slide, a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aim at, result in, or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. This definition means to clarify that violence and harassment can be understood to encompass different conducts, either independent or escalating conducts, and very important, it includes gender-based violence and harassment, which is also defined by this text. For our purpose today, I think it's important to highlight that the definition proposed for gender-based violence and harassment that you can also see in the slide explicitly includes sexual harassment. So next slide, please. Regarding where violence and harassment can take place, the text reflects the agreement that violence and harassment can occur in the course of, link with, or arising out of work. Specifically, this definition takes out violence and harassment, out of the workplace as a physical location. So it considers the workplace, the facilities itself, but also the places where the worker is paid, take a meal or a rest, or use changing facilities, when commuting to and from work, during work-related trips, training, events, or social activities, through work-related communications enabled by information or communications technology, and in employer-provided accommodation. This definition also tries to capture the new forms of organization of work, including the use of technology and information technologies. Please, next slide. Who can be a victim or a perpetrator of violence and harassment in the workplace? Well, the definition clearly refers to employers and workers and the respective representative, but also to third parties as clients, customers, service providers, users, and any other type of public. It is important to note that the text also calls for identifying sectors, occupation, work arrangement, and groups in situation of vulnerability that may be more exposed to violence and harassment in the world of work. So next slide, please. Now, moving to the to our specific topic today, the sexual harassment in the world of work. Well, as I mentioned, the instrument defines sexual harassment as a form of gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. It is also important to highlight that sexual harassment is also considered to be a serious form of sex discrimination in the workplace, as already mentioned by the previous panelists. So it would be impossible, and I would say inconvenient, to draw up a list of the range of behaviors which can be considered as sexual harassment. Nevertheless, we can identify common aspects in national legislation, policies, and the global practice. So basically, we can define sexual harassment as a sex-based or sexual behavior that is unwelcome, as we have already said, to its recipient. It is also unreasonable and unacceptable. We can see two types of sexual harassment in the workplace. First one, what we call quid pro quo, when it's basically when a worker is asked for a sexual favor and submitting to or rejecting that request is used to make a decision about that worker's job. This is very linked with the previous aspect that I mentioned on discrimination. I think this is the form that we are more used to, let's say, talk about. And the second type of sexual harassment form is what we call the hostile working environment. Basically, it covers conduct that create an intimidating, hostile, or humiliating working environment. And it could be, for example, gestures, jokes, displaying pornographic or humiliating sex-related material at a workstation, etc. Next slide, please. So it's one of the main also characteristic of sexual harassment is that it has extended roots. And if we want really to refer and respond to this topic in the workplace, we need to consider that these roots have different origins, cultural, social, economic, and that can have we can have an intersection of different discrimination causes as well. So if we want to eliminate sexual harassment in the workplace, we need a comprehensive and multidisciplinary approach that has a really preventive focus. So the good or the added value of the workplace is that in fact, it has a primary preventive role. So it is intended to ensure that sexual harassment doesn't take place, and also will try to respond it in early stage and mitigate the likelihood of going through a legal process that could be exhausted for the victim and the workplace itself by preventing, not only repairing. So what type of responses we can give and how this comprehensive and multidisciplinary approach look like. Next slide, please. I don't pretend to give you like one size fits all formula, but what I'm trying to do is to list some elements that have shown to be effective as per research and assessment of practices. Some of them were already mentioned by the previous panelists, so I won't, let's say, go in depth, but just mention some, if you want, hints that could be interesting when applying or putting in place this mechanism. Well, we have talked about policies and the importance of have zero tolerance policies regarding sexual harassment. This is a trend that we have seen very much in the past years. Nevertheless, this is, I mean, even if it's a good point to make sure that everybody in the workplace understands that sexual harassment is not tolerated, research shows that these policies have to be very comprehensive, defining what, who, and where. Basically, some of the elements we already seen, and also putting in place procedures and monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. It means that just the simple declaration seems not to be enough, but it really has to be a clear understanding of what we are talking about and what are the consequences. Policies also should be disseminated because what research and experience show us is that workers' perception of the organization tolerance are more, let's say, important when and more effective than the policy itself or putting in place just rules or mechanisms. Complaint and investigation procedures is another mechanism that we need to put in place. But when we talk about complaint and investigation procedures, the main issue is to think about who is the person that will receive the complaint. So the importance here is that we can offer a choice of individuals to whom harassment can be reported. In some cases, the worker would have to report harassment to a superior that could be very close to the perpetrator, or even sometimes a man, and she or he cannot be comfortable with. So it's important to have an open offer and an open choice when deciding or giving complaints channels. Regarding sanctions, it is important that all these policies will be really accompanied by deterring sanctions, but more important, to ensure that the decisions or sanctions that have been agreed have further action. Most of the research show that formal or informal sanctions are not follow-up, and this is really discouraging for victims, and it makes to lose hope on the process. Support mechanisms to be put in place are very, very important, specifically social support mechanism that again should be gender oriented. I mean, having a diversity of providers that could be deliver this support mechanism. And then training and awareness raising, as it was mentioned by the previous panelists. Two other aspects that I'm leaving for last but not least, because I think are very important, is how we integrate sexual harassment and psychosocial risk factors as part of our OSH management system. And here, basically, what we are suggesting and we call for is to incorporate the assessment of risk factors, psychosocial risk factor, organizational risk factor into the OSH management system and assessment. So aspects like physical features of the workplace, managerial style, the permeability from the external environment, and the task situation are key issues to be taken into consideration. And finally, equality and non-discrimination. I mean, if we really want to be effective in fighting and eliminating sexual harassment in the workplace, we need also to consider discrimination and equality as part of the strategy. So since the recruitment process, salaries, wage, and any type of benefits, including an equality perspective and non-discrimination actions are really important to change the culture in the workplace that can originate sexual harassment. So this is what I wanted to share with you today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana Catalina. So we will now open up for questions. We have received 2 questions already in the question box, but then we will hear from others as we go on. But the first 2 questions, they're quite interlinked. The first one is, can you hear me? Okay. The first one is about if neither the employer nor the local authority take sexual harassment seriously, what can you do? What are the mechanisms or what are the actions that you propose that a woman take in this situation, or a group of women? The other question is around the convention. How can an individual woman hold the employer accountable using the convention as a mechanism? So these are the 2 questions that we have so far. And if Ana Catalina and Gisela, you could start answering those, and then we'll see what other questions come in afterhand. So maybe we can start with Ana Catalina. I'm going to see if I can. Oh, you're unmuted. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, regarding the convention, I think it's very important just to clarify that the convention has not been, the text of this convention has not been adopted yet. We are going to have a next discussion in 2019, June 2019, and the International Labour Conference will, let's say, hopefully adopt a text on a convention and a recommendation on violence and harassment in the world of work. So if this is the scenario, let's say we have a convention that has been adopted by the International Labour Conference, the different state members would have to go through the process of national adoption of the convention. It means the ratification. When the convention is ratified by a member state, it's a binding instrument, and the process to be followed is, of course, to comply through national policies, legislation, regulations, and practices, of course, with this convention. So it's a process that we hope would give the member states the opportunity really to incorporate, once adopted the convention, this topic in their national legislation through different mechanisms, and this would be also reflected in the workplace. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. I thought you can. Could you please repeat the other questions? I think Ana Caterina did great in the first one.
So the other question is, if your employer or the local authority, neither of them take sexual harassment seriously, what other course of action do you have? What other options do you have? What can you do?
I think one thing that we should put a lot of effort is about training in our employers, in our employees, because training is the key in order to detect sexual harassment. Sometimes sexual harassment is not that obvious. There are some comments, there's some mild behavior, but they are really damaging. So I think training in a public policy, like a compulsory training every year for all staff, that should be a very necessary thing to do in order to all the agents could identify the situation and stop it. And it actually not just identify, to prevent it is very important as well. So training, I will put the accent on this.
Thank you. We also have Liz, who has raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute Liz Mavangi. Liz, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Anna and Gisela, for that. I'm an undergraduate student, and one of the things my friends and I are currently doing is we started a platform where we try and help leaders in school navigate through different things they go through in their internships. So one of the questions we're always asking ourselves is still under sexual harassment. So let's say as an intern who goes for an internship for 3 months and I face sexual harassment in the workplace, how can I learn to navigate such an environment, knowing that, you know, an internship is not like a workplace where you're going to stay for, let's say, more than 1 year. It's a very short period of time. How do you protect yourself as a young college lady from such advancements made in the workplace?
Thank you so much, Liz, for that question. Do the speakers, the panelists, need some clarification?
Yeah, please. I didn't hear it very well for connection.
So my understanding of this question is for young women undertaking internships. That is not a very long period of time. What can be done for young women? Is that correct, Liz? I'm unmuting you just to clarify.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you, Liz.
Okay, if I may, I'm Gisela. I think an internship situation is a workplace situation. So, as I said before, sometimes sexual harassment can be not that obvious. So, all the behavior that make you feel uncomfortable, we should train people to identify if something is making me feel uncomfortable. there's something wrong about it. We, as a woman, we have been socialized to stand a lot of situations that we shouldn't be standing. So we have to revise it, and if something is making us feeling uncomfortable, it's not working. I mean, there is something that we should try to report to authorities, to our employers. We should change our cultural consideration about internship. We don't have to stand. Sorry? Yeah.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, we have to take the internship situation as any other work situation, not less important. I don't know if I make myself clear.
Thank you so much. Ana Catalina, do you have something to add? You are unmuted, Ana Catalina.
Okay, here I am. I am now unmuted. Thanks. Yes, I think that the point that Gisela is raising about internship, I mean, as part of the workplace, it's key. And I think that there are many aspects, and this also relate with the previous question regarding also how we can address sexual harassment in the workplace from also with innovative responses that could benefit also prevention, especially addressed to those groups that are most vulnerable, if I may say, in the workplace, like, for example, interns or young women that feel an unstable position, etc. I think that looking for alternatives as using, for example, technology, in this case in favor or to support knowledge and training, as also the participant was saying, you know, through the electronic platforms, and also incorporating non-traditional services in the workplace, like, for example, the welfare department, training department, the occupational health services, and even a community level. It's important to create really awareness about what sexual harassment is, and how I can address it in a very hostile environment.
Thank you so much. So we have another person who has raised the hand. We'll take two more questions before we wrap up. One we have in the comment box is, if an employee have signed on and agreed to the sexual harassment policy of the company, but then failed to comply, what can the company do as a next step? What would be the next step if the employee is not complying with the sexual harassment policy in the company? So that's the question number one. Question number two is the hand raised by Nana Fofana. I will unmute you and you can ask your question, Nana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nana Fofana. I'm a public health professional. So I kind of wanted to go back to the question regarding internships, only because I myself, when I was a graduate student getting my master's, I have done several internships as an undergraduate. So I kind of just wanted to provide more feedback from my experience. One thing I would say regarding internships, just like what the panelists have graciously said, is that it is part of the workforce. So therefore, as long as the student is in that institution, that workplace, that organization, they also go through the same, most of the time, at least they should go through the same orientation and provided the same information about, you know, sexual harassment. And of course, if you're doing this kind of thing, which is great that you're leading that platform, kind of reminding students that that's something that they should be provided, and also working with the institutions. And from my experience, another thing with internships, most of the time, you do have to have your professor, an advisor from the school that is also signing off on your internships, therefore observing an internship, because at least for me, it was part of academic requirement. So whether it's part of academic requirement or not, it's always advisable to make sure if you have an academic advisor, inform them that, hey, this is where I'm going to intern, because But when it's academic requirement, you do have to report to that individual about how your internship went, and therefore if you met your objectives for your internship. So I think that individual as well, in terms of your academic institution, your advisors can also serve as the sounding board and somebody that you should feel comfortable, or students should feel comfortable to go ahead and say, hey, this is what I experienced and this is what's going on. So that's just my input I wanted to contribute.
Thank you so much, Nana, for this encouragement as well to young people and people in undertaking internships to also make sure that the academic institution is aware of what's going on and can be supportive in that regard. So thank you so much, Nana. So I will turn to the panelists to answer the previous question, which basically was if the employee has agreed to the sexual harassment policy of the company but failed to comply, what are the steps for the company to take? Who wants to go first, Gisela or Ana Catalina? Ana Catalina, I see you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I would like first of all just to say, and I think I included in my presentation, although I didn't point it out, is that any workplace policy against sexual harassment or addressing other issue should be developed with full participation of workers. And this is a key issue to really engage the managers and the employers with the compliance of such policies. Putting in place monitoring and evaluation mechanism, as I said, is also a key issue, because this monitoring and evaluation mechanism should take into consideration, for example, the number of cases that were solved, or the number of complaints, but also the preventive activities that were put in place. So first, it's a way of make employers and managers accountable for the policy. Of course, that any country has its own legislation and steps to be followed in case of that internal procedures are not don't solve, let's say, any dispute, and that would have legal consequences for the enterprise. So I think that really ensuring that this participation of workers and monitoring and evaluation it's put in place would be the most, let's say, preventive way of addressing non-compliance of policies.
Thank you so much, Ana Catalina. Gisela?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I totally agree with Ana Catalina about the monitoring process, because all the stakeholders should be aware about that complaint procedure, how to do it, how to complain, but you can have a gap in their enterprise. I mean, the employers should follow the change of this procedure. I mean, and you can guarantee that with monitoring. So each country has its own law to proceed, and once one worker is complaining about this, it should have a one-way direction to solve the situation, and the employer couldn't be a stop in this procedure. So monitoring is a must.
Thank you very much. We have one final question that I thought we'll take before we wrap up. It's basically somebody from Germany asking, what role could companies play in helping in the abuse by foreign staff in developing countries. There is many cases that we've heard where development aid staff or other international staff in developing countries are abusing local population or local individuals. What role could companies play to help prevent and mitigate these abuses? Gisela, you have your mic open, so.
Okay. Well, I think company, as in other situations, company should have a very clear manifesto, sexual harassment policy, and that policy should be spread with all their workers. I mean, everyone should be aware about this policy and what a sexual harassment is and how to complain about it and what you can and what you can do at work. So I think spread this policy and having this policy, this file on the web page on the company. I mean, everyone have to be aware about this. This is one real way to prevent this situation. I mean, just inform everyone. Just a quick shortcut.
Thank you. A final word from Ana Catalina.
Just to add to what Gisela just said, I think that a very important role that supply chains, multinationals or international companies that are based outside their countries, in developing countries, can do is to support through training and tools their suppliers at the national and local level, especially on this type of issue, code of practices or policies. I think this is something we can see more and more now on, and that really is having a strong impact, especially at the community level in promoting cultural change. So I think that it's also something that in practice can be done by international companies or enterprises in other developing countries.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of this webinar, but it's just the beginning of the discussions here from our side. What we will do, we are working on a specific toolkit for companies on the type of actions that they can take. We will share the materials that we have discussed, the toolkit that Dianova has prepared, and the UN Women brief. We also hope to continue to inform you about the development and the updates from the convention from ILO. And I would like to encourage all of those online from companies and the private sector to sign on to the Women's Empowerment Principles and get involved in our community. Before we close, I have, as the moderator, a few more questions. So the next question is, how satisfied are you with the information that you have received today? Thank you so much for that, and Gisela and Ana Catalina, well done. We have 80% very satisfied audience, so thank you so much for that. We have the next question. Now, after the webinar, how informed do you feel that you are with the policies on sexual harassment at work? Informed, somehow informed, or not informed at all? Great. So the percentage from beginning of the webinar has gone up. We have a higher percentage of informed people, which is also above 80%. So thank you so much again to our panelists. And the final question is, would you like to receive more information and updates? We'll share the recording. We will continue to keep you up to date on the work that we are doing under the We Empower program, but also broadly in ILO and UN Women, and from the speakers today as well. So 100% would like to continue to be involved. Thank you so much for that. And I would like to thank all of you, particularly the two panelists, Gisela and Anna Catalina, for joining us today and sharing some of their work and their experiences. And thank you so much for the great audience and for your excellent questions and contributions to the conversation. I hope that you'll all have a great holiday season, and that we will connect next year with new speakers and webinars. And please write to us if you feel like you have something to share, you would like to join us either in an e-discussion, in person in some event, or through another webinar. Just get in touch with us, Twitter, Facebook, but you can also write to us by email in follow-up to the email that we'll send out after the webinar. Will also indicate how you can reach us if you don't already know. And I would also like to thank the organizing team here in UN Women. And we also had one of our team members in Canada. Thanks for joining and contributing to this conversation. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day and a great holiday season.